Welcome back to Apexoraz.
Great to be back.
In our last deep dive, we explored Schopenhauer's critique of Plato and his very lofty metaphysical aims.
We did indeed. Plato's focus on the forms, the ideal world.
Exactly. Today, though, we're turning to Aristotle, a mind Schopenhauer definitely admired for its sharpness, its acuteness.
Absolutely.
But also criticized pretty heavily, actually, for what he saw as a lack of depth and method.
It's a really fascinating tension in Schopenhauer's view.
It really is. So the big question for us today, was Aristotle, a true empiricist laying the groundwork for science, or was he more of a scattered genius? That's what we're diving into.
Wow. Sounds good. A complex figure, no doubt.
Definitely. And just a heads up, don't miss our next deep dive where we'll tackle the Stoics. As always, you can follow Apexoraz on Spotify and YouTube for all our explorations.
So Aristotle, Schopenhauer gives us this really compelling, though, as you said, critical perspective.
Yep.
He kicks off by acknowledging Aristotle's preeminent acuteness. His amazing powers of observation, his incredibly broad intellectual range.
He sees the sharpness right away.
Right. But then, almost in the same breath, comes the counterpoint. This sharpness, Schopenhauer argues, existed alongside a pretty significant want of depth.
Okay, so sharp, but shallow. Maybe that's too simple, but what does Schopenhauer really mean by depth here? He says Aristotle's conception of the world is tame, although acutely worked out.
Yeah, that tame description is telling, isn't it?
It is. You've mapped every single ripple on the surface of the lake meticulously, but you never dove in to see what's actually down there. What's the fundamental difference Schopenhauer's drawing?
Well, he makes this really key distinction between depth of thought and acuteness. Depth, for Schopenhauer, comes from within. It's that digging into fundamental questions. The source is internal.
Introspection?
Kinda, yeah. Whereas acuteness relies on external data. It's about how well you receive and analyze information coming at you from the outside world.
Got it. So depth is finding the material inside yourself. Acuteness is processing what comes from outside.
Precisely. Think of someone with really profound, maybe unsettling inner insights versus someone just incredibly good at observing and categorizing what they see.
Okay, that makes sense. And Aristotle was definitely a keen observer, but Schopenhauer hits on a huge problem for Aristotle's time. The empirical data available was, few and often false.
Exactly. That's a crucial point.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. If the basic facts you're working with are shaky or just plain wrong, it doesn't matter how brilliant your analytical mind is, right? Your conclusions are going to be limited. What does Schopenhauer think this means for us looking back at Aristotle now?
Well, this is why Schopenhauer argues that studying Plato often remains more, let's say, profitable. Plato was wrestling with those internal materials of thought, big questions about being, knowledge, reality itself, things that arguably haven't been totally superseded by 2,000 years of science.
Right, those questions persist.
So it really makes you wonder, given how much our empirical understanding has exploded since Aristotle, what's the lasting value in studying his specific approach to investigating the world?
And Schopenhauer seems particularly sharp, no pun intended, when he talks about Aristotle's metaphysics. He argues that the lack of depth is really obvious there. He says something like, mere acuteness will not suffice.
Yeah, it's like that sharpness isn't enough for the really big questions.
Trying to grasp the essence of reality just by, cataloging surface appearances. What's the core problem Schopenhauer has with the metaphysics?
He basically describes it as largely a critique of earlier thinkers, but not a deep engagement, more like focusing on isolated sayings without penetrating their meaning. And he uses that really vivid image. Aristotle is like one who breaks windows from the outside, just smashing at the surface, not getting inside to understand the structure of their thought.
So less building his own system in the metaphysics and more just taking potshots at his predecessors.
That's definitely Schopenhauer's take.
Yeah.
He points out how few of Aristotle's own connected dogmas you actually find in that work. It's mostly critique.
Interesting.
Though, he does admit, there's an accidental service here.
Oh.
Because in attacking them, Aristotle inadvertently preserved bits and pieces of these older philosophies that might otherwise be lost.
Okay, a silver lining. Schopenhauer also seems to zero in on the Aristotle-Plato relationship. He suggests Aristotle was most hostile to Plato, precisely where Plato is entirely right. especially about the theory of forms, the ideas.
But the ideas, it's like Aristotle just couldn't stomach them.
Schopenhauer says it's like something he keeps trying to digest but can't, keep spitting it back out. He just wouldn't accept their validity.
Yeah, that cannot digest metaphor is powerful. It really highlights how fundamentally different their philosophical starting points were. A deep incompatibility.
But Schopenhauer does give Aristotle his due, where observation is key. He says acuteness suffices in the empirical sciences, and grants Aristotle that preeminently empirical bent.
Absolutely. In fields where careful observation is paramount, that sharp intellect was a huge advantage, no question.
So his focus on the observable world, that was important groundwork, right, for later science?
Oh, undeniably. Crucial groundwork. But, as Schopenhauer quickly adds, the sheer progress of experience since Aristotle's time means his specific scientific findings are, mostly outdated now.
It's like appreciating an old map's artistry, but you're still going to use GPS to get around today.
Exactly that. Though he does make one exception.
Zoology.
Yeah, he mentions zoology as perhaps the one area where Aristotle might still have some direct use. Maybe those incredibly detailed observations of animals have held up better.
That seems plausible. His biological work was pretty groundbreaking for the time.
It was extraordinary. But then Schopenhauer circles back to what he sees as a fundamental flaw. This empirical focus, this sharpness, actually led Aristotle to continually dissipate himself.
Meaning?
He just couldn't stick with one line of thought for long enough. He jumped around too much.
Too agile, maybe? Constantly flitting from one interesting thing to the next. Schopenhauer says he was almost incapable of following out any line of thought to the end. Which is kind of fatal for deep philosophy, isn't it?
It really is. Schopenhauer paints this picture of Aristotle constantly starting problems but only touching them, and then moving on without that deep dive needed for real insight.
Leaving the reader hanging.
Totally. He says the reader keeps thinking, now it's coming, the big payoff, the deep truth.
But it never quite lands.
It doesn't come. It remains just out of grasp. Schopenhauer feels like the truth has been hanging upon his lips right before Aristotle darts off onto something else entirely.
That's incredibly frustrating to imagine as a reader. He compares it to a child dropping one toy to grab another.
Yeah, that analogy really sticks. And he calls this the vivacity of superficiality. Lots of energy, lots of movement, but not achieving real depth.
So this is the weak side of his intellect, according to Schopenhauer.
Pretty much. And it leads to another interesting point. We often credit Aristotle with separating and classifying the sciences, right? Bringing order.
The great organizer.
But Schopenhauer argues that while he categorized sciences brilliantly, his actual writing often lacks that same systematic structure and methodical flow.
So the librarian with the messy desk.
Kind of, yeah. His method was more like thinking with a pen in his hand, just writing down ideas as they occurred to him without a rigid pre-planned structure.
Which leads to?
Planlessness, Schopenhauer says, insufficiency, repetition, a difficult reading experience where you feel like you're being led about by the nose.
And then abrupt restarts. He quotes the Greek.
Let's start again from another beginning.
Yeah.
That happens. And the Latin motto he applies, quid fertanto dignum promissor hiatu, basically asks, what worthy thing will this big talker actually produce? It suggests the introductions promise more than the text delivers.
Wow, that's a harsh critique. Confused and unsatisfactory for much of his work. But then there's the exception, the rhetoric.
Ah, yes, the 3 books of the rhetoric. Schopenhauer praises this highly, calls it a model of scientific method, beautifully structured, architectonically symmetrical. He even wonders if Kant learned something from it.
What made the rhetoric stand out so much for him? Why was it different?
Well, it shows Aristotle could be systematic and focused when he set his mind to it with a clear goal. But Schopenhauer insists this wasn't his default mode. And then he immediately contrasts this with Plato.
Right. Plato, who supposedly holds fast to his leading thought as if with an iron hand, following that thread meticulously, even through winding dialogues.
Exactly. Schopenhauer sees Plato's dialogues as carefully planned works of art. Everything connects, even if subtly. Episodes might seem like tangents, but they illuminate the core themes and eventually circle back.
So Plato always knew where he was going, even if he didn't always reach a final, definitive answer.
That's the idea, a clear sense of the intellectual destination. Schopenhauer even brings up historical gossip.
Oh, about Plato and Aristotle, personally.
Yeah, Aelian's accounts suggesting Plato found Aristotle a bit unsteady, flashy, and levity. Talented, sure, but maybe lacking gravitas.
Interesting. Could personality have shaped their philosophies that much?
It's tempting to think so, isn't it? Those temperamental differences might well play out in how they approach philosophy. Schopenhauer uses Schiller's poem, breadth and depth. Aristotle as the breadth, Plato as the depth.
A neat summary. But okay, back to Aristotle's empiricism. Despite acknowledging his empirical bent, Schopenhauer flatly states he wasn't a logical and methodical empiricist.
Right. And this, he argues, is why Aristotle was eventually overthrown by Francis Bacon. Bacon of Verulam, whom Schopenhauer crowns the true father of empiricism.
That's a really strong claim, overthrown by Bacon.
It is. And Schopenhauer says, if you want to see why, go read Aristotle's De Generatione et Corruptione on generation and corruption. He sees it as the perfect example of an a priori approach to nature.
Meaning trying to figure out nature just by thinking about it, using logic rather than looking?
Pretty much. Trying to deduce how nature must work from abstract principles. He points to what he calls the a priori chemistry in Book 1, Chapter 4, as a prime example of how flawed this is. Like trying to invent the periodic table through armchair reasoning.
Instead of, doing experiments.
Exactly. And Bacon, conversely, championed grounding our knowledge of nature firmly in perceptual experience. Observation and experiment first.
And Schopenhauer clearly sees the brilliant result of Bacon's approach in modern science. We can look back at Aristotle's physics or chemistry with, Schopenhauer says, a piteous smile.
He doesn't hold back. He even connects works like Generation and Corruption and the De Colo on the heavens directly to the rise of scholasticism.
How so?
He sees Aristotle's method in these works, the logical deductions from potentially flawed concepts, as the root of that later scholastic quibbling word-juggling method.
Wow. He gives examples from De Colo, right? Like proving a priori there can't be multiple worlds.
Yes. Or speculating about how the stars must move based on mere conception and locis communibus, just ideas and common assumptions, not actual observation.
It sounds like building a whole cosmology based on logic puzzles rather than looking through a telescope.
That's a good way to put it. Schopenhauer calls it logical reasoning from false conceptions, a kind of nature dialectic, trying to tell nature how it ought to behave based on axioms, instead of asking nature how it does behave.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? When you think about how long these ideas held sway and the debt we owe to people like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Bacon, Newton.
Absolutely. Schopenhauer really emphasizes this. Here's this incredible intellect, Aristotle, completely tangled up in errors about the cosmos that lasted for centuries.
And he details Aristotle's cosmology, the fixed stars on a sphere, the sun and planets closer, light from friction, a stationary Earth. Schopenhauer calls it absurd.
Especially frustrating, Schopenhauer notes, because Aristotle knew about the Pythagorean view, the basically correct idea of the Earth moving, but he just dismissed it.
Schopenhauer says reading that rejection can hardly fail to arouse our indignation.
You can feel his frustration, especially since Aristotle often attacked thinkers like Empedocles or Democritus, who Schopenhauer feels actually had better insights into nature because they paid more attention to experience.
He mentions Empedocles having an idea about tangential force from revolution.
Yeah, a surprisingly modern-sounding insight that Aristotle just missed or ignored, sticking instead to vulgar opinion, common sense view, even about basic things like up and down in the cosmos.
And the huge consequence, Schopenhauer stresses, is that Aristotle's immense authority effectively buried these earlier, sometimes better ideas. His cosmology became the cosmology, the basis for Ptolemy, lasting until the 16th century.
A massive detour for science, in Schopenhauer's view.
Then he makes another really interesting connection, the compatibility of this Earth-centered, hierarchical Aristotelian universe with religion.
Yes, specifically Jewish-Christian dogma. A layered heaven in the sky fits neatly with the idea of a god residing up there.
Whereas a Copernican, heavenless astronomy, that poses a challenge, doesn't it? If there's no specific up there for God to be.
Right. Schopenhauer suggests it conceptually leaves no room left for God in that traditional spatial sense.
And so, he argues, the Church's opposition to Copernicus and Galileo wasn't just dogma, it was almost logical self-preservation, recognizing the threat to their worldview.
That's his provocative suggestion. He even floats the idea that maybe a secret knowledge or a sort of intuition about how well Aristotle's physics fit with church doctrine played a role in why Aristotle was so revered in the Middle Ages.
That's quite a thought, that the philosophical framework and the religious framework sort of propped each other up.
It raises deep questions about how ideas gain traction and why they stick around. Schopenhauer even muses that maybe Thanks to Aristotle's own reporting of older systems, some people secretly understood the truth about the cosmos long before Copernicus.
Hidden knowledge preserved by the very person whose ideas suppressed it. Wow.
So yeah, wrapping up Schopenhauer's very layered view. Aristotle, undeniably acute, massively influential, but ultimately, in Schopenhauer's eyes, lacking that deep, methodical, truly empirical grounding that Bacon later championed.
His brilliance was maybe too scattered, his insights sharp but sometimes skin deep, and his mistakes had really long shadows.
That sums it up pretty well. Sharpness without sufficient depth, leading to influential errors.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Was he a true empiricist or more of that scattered genius? Schopenhauer definitely seems to lean towards scattered geniuses, doesn't he? Brilliant, foundational in some ways, but limited by method and maybe temperament. What's the takeaway for you after revisiting this?
Well, thinking about how incredibly influential Aristotle was, despite these flaws Schopenhauer points out, it really makes you ponder the nature of intellectual progress itself. Why do certain ideas, even flawed ones, have such staying power? What does it take for a paradigm shift to actually happen?
That's a great point to leave our listeners with. How do ideas persist? Something to definitely mull over. Okay, join us next time on Apexoraz when we turn our attention to the Stoics.
Looking forward to it.
And please remember to follow Apexoraz on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your deep dives. Thanks for